Captain Charles B. MacDonald understood the war almost immediately. It was not won by grand strategy or sweeping pronouncements. Victory was secured only by the sheer, grinding endurance of the combat infantrymen. It was a rough, serious business. It was a dread, gnawing daily diet that swallowed any romanticized notions whole. MacDonald was a freshly minted 20-year-old replacement. He arrived in September 1944. He was already burdened by intense self-doubt. His limited combat experience stood in stark contrast to the veterans of Company I. These men had fought ashore on D+1 and captured Brest. This immense disparity fueled a corrosive self-doubt. It made the burden of leadership feel impossibly heavy. The journey to the front had been a visceral introduction to the war's misery. They rode in rough troop trains, crammed into the infamous 40 and 8 cars. This was followed by a final fatiguing march uphill in the rain. Upon reaching Germany on October 3, 1944, the theoretical preparations ended abruptly. His first combat orders were delivered during a briefing in the woods by Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Paul V. Tuttle. This marked MacDonald's personal, irreversible turning point into lived experience. He found his company settled into the static, brutal realities of the Siegfried Line. This defense was characterized by its concrete dragon's teeth and formidable anti-tank wall. The company command post was a supposed sanctuary carved into the earth. It was a pillbox whose air was cold, damp, stale, and perpetually smelled of dust and dried man-sweat. Outside, the terrain was a misery of heavy mist and fine rain. The mud was a thick, sucking morass that sucked at their boots with every step. The tactical situation was precarious. The company's front line extended 500 yards. The 3rd platoon on the far right was dangerously exposed. They were unable to raise their heads in daylight without drawing enemy fire. Worse, a 200-yard gap stretched to their right before K Company's battered lines began. This vulnerability was underscored by the fact that K Company had been stampeded just 2 nights prior. They had suffered heavy casualties in a pillbox. MacDonald, the inexperienced captain, knew his internal uncertainty could not show. He felt the critical need to project confidence. He admitted this sentiment to his subordinate, Sergeant Savage. Savage responded with a weary, profound acknowledgement that defined their existence. "We all are," he said. "We always are." The psychological strain was immense. Constant German observation from a high ridge rendered Allied positions vulnerable. Initial communications were severely lacking. This forced runners to risk their lives only at night. The men subsisted on monotonous K-rations. These rations were often cold as a witch's tit. The cold, hungry riflemen and machine gunners endured the fine needlepoint spray of rain in their waterlogged foxholes. Yet amidst the grim reality, there were islands of human resilience. MacDonald recalled Private First Class Willie Hagan, a 39-year-old regular who kept spirits up. He also remembered 18-year-old Private First Class Hubert Berger, who sought solace by reading his Bible in the crowded, damp cellar. A critical, temporary stabilization arrived with the successful establishment of sound-powered telephone communications with the forward platoons. This small, crucial victory greatly improved situational awareness and command control. It alleviated some of the psychological isolation. Further relief came with the arrival of 3 57mm anti-tank guns towed by jeeps. This was a crucial advantage that momentarily alleviated the pervasive fear of German flame-throwing half-tracks. After enduring 15 days of mounting tension and slow, fatiguing marches, the 2nd Division was hastily shifted. They were moved to block one wing of the German offensive during the Battle of the Bulge. This strategic pivot dramatically increased the immediate threat. Following the defense of the Siegfried Line, and before the full fury of the Bulge erupted, the company was ordered to withdraw to higher ground. They were to consolidate their lines for the coming winter. This move created a deceptive quiet sector, but the calm was constantly shattered by enemy probing. A surprise bayonet assault on the 1st Platoon outpost by 40 Germans on November 21st, though resulting in no casualties, reinforced the company's awareness. Their positions, hastily constructed and undermanned, were perilous. The constant rain and mud were quickly giving way to a biting cold. The deep rumble of far-off artillery increased each night. It sounded like deep drums setting the scene for the main terrifying act. 5 days before December 16, 1944, The order came to move to an assembly area near Rocherath. This signaled the end of the static defense and the dawn of high-stakes, desperate combat. The Battle of the Bulge arrived not with a slow build, but with the sudden, catastrophic urgency of a collapsing dam. The 2nd Division was yanked from its static defences and hurled into the breach. Their new mission was a simple, terrifying imperative: block the German offensive. Captain MacDonald's unit was rushed into an assembly area near Rocherath, 4 miles from Saint-Vit, Belgium. The journey was a 5-hour nightmare of cold, snow and hazardous blackout, driving through an ice-covered forest. The shift from the methodical misery of the Siegfried Line to this immediate high-stakes crisis was MacDonald's true baptism by fire. It turned every lesson learned in theory into a brutal, lived test. Upon reaching a snow-covered road junction, the chaos was immediate. Elements of the shattered 99th Division were scattered and disoriented. Their defeat signaled the scale of the enemy thrust. Initial orders to counterattack were quickly rescinded. The enemy force was simply too large. The new directive was grim, absolute, and impossibly difficult. The men were told to dig in where they are and hold at all costs. The men clawed at the frozen earth with primitive entrenching shovels. They carved inadequate positions in the rock-hard ground. They knew they faced a severe shortage of ammunition. The defence began not with a bang, but with a horrifying wail. It was the incoming Nebelwerfer barrage. The screaming Mebies descended upon them, a sound of pure psychological terror. The initial barrage killed 7 men and wounded 20. It transformed the woods into a landscape of chaos and fear. The full fury of the assault hit around 3 o'clock in the morning. It was a relentless storm of heavy small arms fire and mortar barrages that ripped through the fir trees. Communication lines, already fragile, snapped under the intensity. This plunged the forward platoons into isolated dread. The silence that followed the explosions was often the most terrifying sound of all. It was broken only by the guttural chatter of a German burp gun or the slow, deliberate reply of an American machine gun. As dawn approached, the true nature of the threat became clear. 5 German Tiger tanks, armoured behemoths carrying devastating 88mm guns, lumbered down the road. They were invincible to the company's small arms. The fate of the defensive line was sealed not by a lack of courage, but by a lack of material support. The Shermans meant to secure the critical left flank had withdrawn 15 minutes before the main push. This left the infantry naked against the steel monsters. Shortages of artillery and bazooka ammunition meant the infantry could only watch, helpless. The enemy armour prepared to destroy their positions. Heroism, MacDonald realised, was insufficient against overwhelming material disadvantage. The defence of the critical crossroads became a desperate, terrifying stand. The constant shelling and the breakdown of command control shredded the nerves of every man. Midway through the ordeal, the sheer psychological toll found voice during a brief, absurd encounter. Fred Bankers, a war correspondent, arrived seeking a feature story on life inside the Siegfried Line. He attempted to elicit sentiments of homesickness. He interviewed Private Croteau, a soldier suffering from a persistent cold. Croteau's nerves were frayed raw by a recent pillbox explosion. Croteau exploded, his voice raw with the truth of the front line. "I've got nothing to say," he told the correspondent. "Tell them it's hell, and tell them there are men getting killed and wounded every minute, and they're miserable and they're suffering. Tell them it's a matter more serious than they'll ever be able to understand. Spread it on thick, and leave off the sweet syrup that all the others write about." It was a visceral, necessary debunking of the stoic soldier myth. It was a cry from the men who were living the nightmare. Under the weight of the Tiger tanks and the collapse of their flanks, the inevitable order came: retreat. The withdrawal was chaotic, a desperate rush through the dense fir trees. It was marked by near misses and the constant hiss of tracers. MacDonald initially felt a crushing sense of personal failure. He was convinced he had broken. But during a frantic regrouping effort in a damp cellar near Elsenborn, Colonel Tuttle provided the desperately needed strategic context. The colonel explained that the company's desperate stand had not been a failure. It had been a crucial delaying action. Several divisions to the south had been completely overrun. The German offensive was a massive, coordinated thrust aimed at Liège and Antwerp. MacDonald's inexperienced company, fighting without adequate support and against overwhelming odds, had bought precious time for reinforcements. The 1st Infantry Division was able to move into line and halt the thrust. The eventual withdrawal to Elsenborn, therefore, was not a defeat, but a strategic repositioning. They had successfully prevented a wider, catastrophic breakthrough. The cost was immense. But the defence had mattered. It underscored that in the chaos of the Bulge, victory was often measured not in ground held, but in minutes purchased. The Allied counteroffensive began not with a glorious charge, but with a relentless, bone-weary grind. The objective was simple: seal off the German penetrations, recapture the lost ground, and push eastward. The winter conditions were their first enemy. The snow and ice turned every movement into an exhausting ordeal. This was exacerbated by the constant psychological toll of anxiety. This pursuit phase was chaotic. It was a demonstration that the battlefield was never the clean, decisive environment depicted in newsreels. Flawed intelligence and communication failures were the true commanders of the day. The push toward the critical highway objective became a perfect demonstration of this chaos. MacDonald's men advanced through 600 yards of dense, snow-laden fir forest. Visibility collapsed as darkness fell. The terrain was treacherous, and the air was thick with tension. Then came the sound that should have been a warning. It was a faint, moaning voice from a patch of firs, crying for help. It was a trap. A seemingly wounded German soldier, feigning blindness, had been placed to lure American troops into a killing zone. This deceptive tactic was designed to draw out the medics and officers. It was followed by a catastrophic breakdown in command. K Company, positioned somewhere to the rear, mistook the movement of I Company for a fresh German patrol and opened fire. The sudden burst of friendly fire, amplified by the frantic, confused radio exchange, was chilling. The enemy was not just in front of them. The enemy was also, effectively, behind them. The captain felt a sudden, searing pain in his leg. It was the sharp sting of a burp gum's tracer fire. As he stumbled, a warm liquid flowed over his leg, confirming the wound. The order to withdraw was not strategic. It was a desperate necessity. The retreat through the woods was fraught. Men lay flat in the snow, while bullets whined low overhead, burying themselves in the fir trees. MacDonald, his radio man Charles also hit, felt consumed by the internal struggle of leadership. He felt the corrosive fear that he had failed his company by choosing to run. He had fallen into a deep hole. He narrowly avoided the blast of a concussion grenade that exploded nearby. Communication remained fractured. Lieutenant Brock's radio was out, preventing any immediate coordination of the retreat. Later, Captain Roy G. McCracken, commander of the anti-tank company, would share his own confusion. He reported that his mine-clearing tank dozer had been attacked by bazooka fire near the road, forcing his retreat. This happened because he was told I Company had secured the highway. It was a claim MacDonald vehemently refuted. The captain's journey through aid stations and hospitals offered a profound, almost hallucinatory contrast to the front. The warmth of the ambulance, the temporary oblivion provided by bourbon and morphine, and finally, the clean white sheets of a comfortable bed. It was a world away from the freezing foxholes and the smell of fear and dried man-sweat. Yet despite the physical relief, his thoughts remained fixed on the men still enduring the brutal reality. He thought particularly of Brock's platoon. They had held through a counterattack by 3 tanks. They watched their worst wounded freeze to death before aid could reach them. As MacDonald recovered and returned to the field, the narrative of the war had shifted dramatically. The relentless pressure of the Allied advance, the First Army pushing across the Rhine, had been suddenly and unexpectedly simplified. This was due to the established Remagen bridgehead, secured by the 9th Armoured Division. On March 25th, the division received orders to commit. The advance across the Rhine began with troops crossing in LCVPs. The initial push felt like a strange war. It was so fluid and unopposed that some soldiers compared it to training maneuvers. Towns like Heimbach were taken with surprising ease. The Burgermeister simply surrendered, reporting the German troops had already departed. The weather was warm and sunny. Soldiers enjoyed comfortable billeting in houses, creating a dangerous, intoxicating sense of security. This illusion was abruptly and violently shattered near Bendorf Seine, located on the Seine River. Here, the supposed cakewalk ended. The advance was halted by unexpected German defences. These included tanks, heavy fire, and a sudden visceral return to the chaos of combat. Company G, now led by Captain Oscar L. Goodson, found itself facing enemy tanks positioned on a wooded hill. The tanks began blasting the advancing houses. A Sherman tank in their formation was crippled by a mine. An SP gun knocked out 4 American light tanks in rapid succession. The situation devolved into a desperate firefight. Lieutenant Thomas D. Bagby was pinned down, unable to advance. Staff Sergeant Thomas W. Patton called for help as German troops attempted a flanking maneuver. Amidst the intense fighting, a burning house and barn became a grotesque focal point. From the swirling smoke and flame emerged a grey-haired old woman. She was calmly leading her horse. This was a disturbing image of civilian trauma that underscored the fact that this was not a maneuver. It was the continuation of a lethal, unpredictable war. The relentless advance had been checked. It reminded the Americans that even in the final stages of collapse, the German army remained a formidable and deadly force. The final drive deep into Germany was less a victory parade and more a logistical nightmare. It was characterized by a relentless, exhausting momentum that tested the physical and mental limits of the infantry. The rapid movement of the Allied armoured spearheads often bypassed pockets of resistance. This created a fluid and chaotic front. It forced the infantry to follow clear and secure. This phase of the war was defined by the maddening cycle of hurry up and wait. Soldiers would be rushed forward in trucks. They would only sit for hours on dusty, congested roads, waiting. They waited for engineers to bridge a blown river or for higher command to coordinate the next move. This constant stop-start motion, coupled with the immense physical strain, compounded the exhaustion. They had to wade shallow rivers and climb steep, horseshoe-curved hills. It was a brutal counterpoint to any perception of a seamless, organized advance. Instead, it revealed an improvised, ad hoc operational environment. Morale was maintained through sheer tenacity and the sight of a crumbling enemy. Higher command, driven by the imperative to reach objectives like Hofgeismar and capture the Ruhr pocket, applied continuous, almost inhuman pressure. The demand to take one more objective forced units like MacDonald's to undertake high-risk exposed advances. This was often done without adequate rest or reconnaissance. The weariness was palpable. One GI, when confronted by a nun offering a hopeful, rehearsed greeting in English, snarled back the bitterness of the line. "Not you, but us, lady," he said. "Go back to your Nazis." The advance towards Schkopau, a critical industrial target, was suddenly and violently stalled near the town of Dorstowitz. The company's forward elements, moving with a deceptive sense of security, were abruptly halted by an ambush. This ambush demonstrated the fragmented but lethal nature of the collapsing German defense. The enemy had strategically positioned an anti-tank gun and several fearsome multiple-barrel 20mm anti-aircraft guns. When fired horizontally, these acted as devastating machine cannons. The memory of a previous, costly ambush at Wormerson, where E Company had suffered casualties, instilled caution. But the Dorstowitz trap was sprung with brutal efficiency. A bazooka man, emerging from behind a brick wall, hit a tank. The blast killed its driver and 3 crewmen. Simultaneously, intense shelling and small arms fire erupted. This transformed the advance into a death gauntlet. The air was filled with flying shrapnel and tracer fire. Lieutenant Bagby's first platoon suffered significant losses. This forced Sergeant Barnes to take command amidst the chaos. Soldiers scrambled desperately for cover. Some found temporary salvation in ditches. Others squeezed into a clever trench dug underneath a culvert. The fear was a living entity. But the soldiers, led by men like the little Jewish soldier Fane, held their ground. Fane displayed remarkable initiative in pushing the tanks forward. After a fierce firefight, the enemy resistance finally collapsed. It was marked by the sudden appearance of white flags. 105 German prisoners were rounded up and crowded onto 2 trucks. But the cost was immediate and heavy. The advance had been bought with blood. It underscored the grim reality that victory, even in the final days, was hard won. The objective of Schkopau, however, remained. As the company moved into Dorstowitz, the illusion of security vanished entirely. Technical Sergeant Floyd W. Campbell's radio report delivered the next devastating piece of intelligence. 12 massive 128mm flak guns were positioned less than 600 yards beyond the town. These guns were capable of firing shells with fuses set for deadly air or contact bursts. They instantly rendered American tanks and tank destroyers useless. The slightest airburst would shred the exposed infantry. Colonel Smith's order was uncompromising and driven by the highest strategic urgency. G Company must take the flak gun position now, before morning. As darkness fell, the initial rushed attempts to dislodge the enemy failed. This highlighted the reckless cost of prioritizing speed over preparation. The situation only grew more desperate, until the Germans began destroying their own guns. This signaled a retreat. This offered a critical, if fleeting, opportunity for a more tactical approach. Colonel Montgomery, recognizing the futility of a direct frontal assault, agreed to a concentrated artillery barrage. The 3rd Platoon, led by Sergeant Barnes, undertook a perilous journey through the inky darkness. They navigated marshy ground and a slippery dirt road toward the position. They found barracks and open fields stretching hundreds of yards. This revealed the true scale of the enemy. Over 100 Germans were milling around the 6 visible flak guns, with 6 more hidden by trees. The final assault was only achieved through the masterful direction of Lieutenant Reed, the artillery observer, and Captain William Granis, the artillery liaison officer. The sustained shelling, despite initially falling short, eventually forced the Germans from their fortified positions. This demonstrated that overwhelming firepower and patient preparation were the decisive factors in overcoming such defenses. The relentless pressure to advance continued. It pushed the men toward the outskirts of Leipzig. Here, German resistance, though fragmented, coalesced into a desperate final stand near a factory complex. The American advance was moving quickly. The path was illuminated by moonlight and the distant sound of shelling. Then a sudden, brutal German counterattack erupted. Flares lit the sky, followed by intense small arms fire and the sharp explosions of Panzerfaust rockets. The assault was overwhelming. It caused the American line to completely collapse. In the ensuing chaos, Lieutenant Whitman's platoon was isolated and trapped in a factory cellar. They were pinned down by the attacking enemy. Whitman, along with 9 of his men and several prisoners they had taken, found themselves surrounded. In a moment of brutal, calculated desperation, Whitman radioed Lieutenant Reed, the artillery observer. He ordered him to direct artillery fire onto his own position. It was a high-stakes, terrifying gamble. It was a calculated risk that the barrage would eliminate the enemy outside the factory walls, allowing his men to survive the blast inside. The wait was agonizing. But the gamble paid off. The overwhelming force of the artillery barrage shattered the German counterattack. As dawn broke, E and F companies moved out for the counterattack. The narrator's company was ordered to follow immediately, foregoing breakfast for the immediate action. The eventual rescue of Whitman, his men, Sergeant Campbell and 30 others was an overwhelming relief. Whitman's voice, raw but alive, sounded over the battalion radio like music. Despite the gnawing fatigue and hunger, the company pushed on. They navigated difficult terrain, railroad bridges, and sniper fire. They had paid an immense price. But they were finally reaching the outskirts of Leipzig. The war's final surreal moments were about to begin. They were purchased through exhaustion, ingenuity, and the difficult, ethical compromises of leadership under fire. The diplomatic surrender of Leipzig had promised a bloodless end to the fighting in Germany's 5th largest city. It ultimately failed. The German general, though willing to give up his headquarters, could not guarantee the compliance of the scattered Wehrmacht units still holding out. The initial surreal negotiations were fueled by cognac and strained politeness in the general's opulent, mahogany-panelled room. They yielded only a conditional agreement. The police would remain armed and in control of the civilians. The Americans would enter forcefully at dawn. MacDonald, who had dreamed of entering Leipzig with the dignity of a victor, instead found himself leading a chaotic, nervous advance. He felt like they were fugitives from a lunatic asylum. The absurdity of the war's end was everywhere. Lieutenant Whitman, a man whose eagerness often bordered on recklessness, was now collecting surrenders like trophies. He had accepted the capitulation of 60 Germans and their lieutenant. The lieutenant had specifically requested to surrender to a captain. This added another layer of bureaucratic farce to the collapse. Whitman's energy was infectious, if often destabilizing. This was exemplified by a night of drunken chaos. He insisted a German girl sleep with him, only to pass out himself. This left the narrator to navigate the strained, newly relaxed non-fraternization rules. The true moment of catharsis arrived not from a strategic victory, but from a logistical accident. In the German garrison warehouses of Leipzig, the company discovered over 2,000 cases of champagne and 2 brand-new Ford trucks. This find transformed the atmosphere. A jubilant cognac party erupted. Hundreds of GIs celebrated their survival. The alcohol washed away 9 months of accumulated fear and exhaustion. Soldiers who had been liberated from German POW camps were served hot meals in a requisitioned restaurant. The celebration symbolized the profound shift from the brutality of combat to the relief of imminent peace. But the war was not yet finished. The regiment was ordered to move southeast. They were to relieve elements of the 97th Division in a defensive sector in Czechoslovakia. The journey was a brutal, dusty transition through miles of German countryside. This was followed by a harrowing drive through twisting, narrow mountain roads. They moved from the relative ease of the German plains into the Sudetenland. The towns there were clusters of white and pale blue stone houses. The roads were often covered in ice and slush. Here, the welcome was subdued. The German civilians were defeated and quiet. They offered no resistance but no joy. Then, they crossed the border into Czechoslovakia proper. The atmosphere detonated. The mood shifted instantly and dramatically. It created a moment of overwhelming emotional release for the exhausted infantrymen. Gone were the subdued German towns. In their place were Czech villages erupting in a riot of red, white and blue Czechoslovakian flags. Civilians lined the streets, cheering, waving, and showering the American vehicles with flowers, cakes, and cookies. The unleashed joy of these oppressed people knew no bounds. Old men and women dropped their farm tasks to embrace the soldiers. Tears of gratitude streamed down their faces. Little boys and girls ran ahead of the jeeps. They thrust bouquets of flowers into the hands of the soldiers and shouted, "Nazdar! Nazdar!" This was a heartfelt salute that embodied 6 years of suppressed freedom. The liberation of Pilsen itself was a carnival and a festival. MacDonald, driven into the city by Colonel Smith, witnessed throngs of cheering civilians. They clambered over vehicles, hugging soldiers and shouting their thanks. The final poignant celebration occurred in the small village of Radzis. The townspeople held a dance for the soldiers. This event felt simultaneously absurd and necessary. A Czech girl named Liba, her face radiant with emotion, sang the national anthem for the first time in 6 years. Her voice broke the long silence of occupation. She then danced with MacDonald. It was a moment of profound, simple human connection that contrasted sharply with the grim reality of the foxholes he had known. Sergeant Quinn brought out the last of the captured cognac. He led a toast to the end of the fighting. The war was ending, not just through military force, but through sheer, joyful insanity. The sight of German soldiers and civilians throwing away their weapons and fleeing westward confirmed the final collapse. The 3rd Battalion took over 1,000 German prisoners. These included youthful soldiers who had been forced into the army only weeks prior. They were assembled in a large open field. It was the final, pathetic harvest of the Reich. On May 7th, the official confirmation arrived. Combat action was over for the division. VE Day would be the next day, May 8th. The news triggered an outpouring of relief so deep it bordered on physical pain. 2 months later, on July 20th, 1945, MacDonald sailed into New York Harbor. He reflected on the profound emotional catharsis of the war's end. Yet, the victory was forever tinged with sorrow. Even amidst the peace, the soldiers carried a hollow place in their hearts for the fallen. These were the fallen fruit of a harvest for the devil. The narrative of the dirty, miserable war would endure. It was a testament to the tenacity, resilience, and unacknowledged heroism of the combat infantrymen. Their faces, though dead, remained alive in memory. They were smiling and waving bravely in the background of a world finally at peace.